Inside Trauma Bay 3 at Mercy Shore Medical Center, fear had a metallic taste. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the air was too cold, and every sound seemed sharpened by urgency into something hard and clinical. A monitor chirped in a frantic rhythm above the rolling clatter of equipment, clipped commands, and the wet hiss of oxygen. In the center of it all, Mara Ellison stood at the edge of the trauma bed with gloved hands held still at her waist, watching a man in a torn Navy training shirt struggle for a breath he could not quite complete. Around him, a room full of trained professionals moved in tight patterns of authority and habit, but Mara's attention was not on the choreography. It was on the details that mattered: the lag in the right side of his chest, the strain in his neck, the compensation that was beginning to fail. Dr. Victor Harlow, trauma director and unquestioned center of Mercy Shore's emergency hierarchy, controlled the room with the kind of certainty hospitals often mistake for leadership. His voice cut across the alarms and sent residents straight-backed into motion. Techs moved faster when he spoke. Nurses stepped around his tone as if it were equipment already occupying the room. Even the two broad-shouldered security men standing near the bay door, men with military posture and concern carefully buried under professional stillness, shifted back from the force of him. Mara did not. She saw what the others were not yet naming and said so with quiet clarity. The patient was compensating and then dropping. His right side was lagging. His neck veins were distended. This was not simply pain. The room reacted the way rooms in polished institutions often do when the least loud person challenges the most important one. A young doctor nearly laughed. Someone near the supply cart muttered with tired contempt. Harlow turned and let his expression say what his words no longer needed to say. Mara was a floor nurse. He was the trauma director. One of them belonged at the center of the bed, and one of them did not. Then the patient's blood pressure dipped again, the waveform on the monitor flattening in a way that made the atmosphere in the room change. The man on the bed tried to speak. His lips moved once under the oxygen mask, but the sound vanished into the alarms. Mara leaned close enough to catch the shape of the effort rather than the word itself. For a fraction of a second, his eyes found hers, and something in his face tightened, not with fear, but with an odd flash of recognition that made no sense. Harlow called for more fluids. A resident echoed him louder. Another nurse moved to spike a new bag. Mara looked once more at the patient's chest, then at the bruising darkening near the clavicle, then at the pressure tracing flattening toward disaster. She said again and with the same maddening calm that if they waited, he would arrest. Harlow's patience finally snapped. He warned her that another interruption would put her out of the bay. A heartbeat later, the patient crashed, and the man everyone important was going to ask about lost his pulse while the least theatrical person in the room moved first. Mercy Shore Medical Center stood on the San Diego waterfront like a polished promise. Glass and steel caught the light by day, donor plaques gleamed in clean atriums, and smiling billboards announced excellence and innovation above photographs of physicians whose whitened smiles looked brighter than the lobby itself. To the public, Mercy Shore was where difficult cases came to be solved, and where wealth and prestige could purchase the comfort of believing time could be negotiated. To the people who worked there, it was a kingdom of layers. The emergency department belonged to whoever could command noise. The ICU belonged to whoever could endure dread without showing it. Administration belonged to people with expensive shoes, careful language, and a talent for turning cruelty into policy. All the invisible labor between those worlds belonged to nurses, techs, coordinators, transport staff, and the professionals everyone praised in speeches and overlooked in ordinary practice. Mara Ellison lived in those invisible spaces. She was 34 night shift float pool, cross-trained in step-down, telemetry, post-op recovery, and emergency overflow. She arrived 7 minutes early, left no mess behind, and only spoke when she had something worth saying. Her dark hair was always twisted into the same practical knot. Her charting was immaculate. Her patients asked for her by name. New hires thought she was shy. Older staff knew she was observant. Neither group fully understood her. She carried a stainless steel travel mug with a dent near the rim and wore a plain silver watch instead of the smart devices most younger nurses preferred. She never lingered for break-room gossip. She never corrected anyone in public unless a patient's safety required it. She never explained herself. That silence invited invention. Mercy Shore became the kind of place that filled silence with rumors. Some said she had been fired from a better hospital and landed there because nowhere else would take her. Some said she was hiding from a divorce. Some said she was one of those nurses who wanted the schedule but not the politics, the kind who clocked in, did the work, and returned home to a small apartment and an even smaller life. Myra never challenged the stories. She never defended herself. She never offered anything personal to people who had done nothing to earn it. That restraint, in a place built on self-display, became its own offense. The first person to openly call her the quiet nurse was a surgical resident in his second week, eager to impress his seniors by making someone else smaller. The nickname stuck because Mercy Shore was the kind of institution that confused restraint with passivity. Mara would enter a room, assess the monitors, straighten a line, ask two precise questions, and somehow make people feel both supported and quietly measured without changing her expression. Dr. Victor Harlow hated that effect more than he admitted. Harlow was brilliant in the way prestigious institutions love most, technically gifted, aggressively composed, and socially engineered for upward movement. At 48, he was immaculate, media-friendly, and always moved like the floor had been informed of his arrival. He had turned Mercy Shore's trauma program into something glossy enough for magazine profiles and donor events. He brought in research money, cultivated board relationships, and knew how to make a successful outcome feel narratively centered on himself. What he did not tolerate was being corrected by people he considered beneath him, and he considered nurses beneath him almost by definition. The first time Mara embarrassed him, it was nearly accidental. A septic patient had been deteriorating for hours while the team fixed its attention on the wrong source. Mara noticed a neglected surgical site, asked for a lactate redraw, and suggested abdominal imaging before the team blamed pneumonia again. The scan proved her right. The patient lived. Harlow never forgave the fact that 3 residents had heard her say it first. After that, he began calling her helpful in a tone that stripped the word of any kindness. Her assignments grew heavier. Her support got thinner. She floated first when staffing broke. When minor charting issues arose on chaotic nights, her name was the one selected for the coaching email. Nothing overt. Nothing clean enough for human resources to act on. Just a series of small administrative cuts designed to remind her where the hierarchy expected her to remain. Denise Klein, the nursing manager for emergency services, made the situation worse by performing sympathy while backing Harlow every time the stakes rose. Denise believed in alliances, visibility, and never choosing the losing side of an internal conflict. She had perfect lipstick, polished empathy, and the gift of sounding humane while preserving the machinery that harmed people beneath her. Once in the medication room, she told Mara that Victor liked confidence, and that Mara made people uncomfortable because she was hard to read. Mara responded that this sounded like other people's discomfort, not her problem. Denise laughed as if it had been a joke, because some people treat any truth they dislike as an awkward attempt at humor. Still, there were signs that did not fit the version of Mara Ellison Mercy Shore had chosen. She could assemble a disaster airway bag in the dark without looking. She knew the hospital evacuation routes better than facilities, and once corrected a safety officer on which stairwell would fail first in a power outage. When helicopters passed overhead, she always glanced at the windows, not with curiosity, but with calculation. During pileups and multi-car traumas, her pulse did not visibly rise. Her hand seemed steadier, not less. A paramedic from Naval Base Coronado once saw the old challenge coin tucked under the plastic of her badge holder and went still for half a second before asking where she had gotten it. Mara simply turned her badge over. Another time, a new graduate nurse watched her fold gauze into compact, exact packets and remarked that it looked military. Mara replied only that it looked efficient. The scars helped too, though no one said much about them. One pale mark near the base of her thumb. Another just above the wrist, visible only when she tied a gown. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest that the life Mara did not discuss had involved more than alarms and staffing grids. Her private life did little to satisfy the curiosity around her. Mara lived in a spare, orderly apartment 12 minutes from the hospital in good traffic and 19 when the Marina Road backed up with ride-shares and restaurant deliveries. The place was neat to the point of discipline. 2 shelves of bow. Okays, a clean kitchen, no decorative clutter. In a drawer rather than on the wall, she kept a faded photograph that nobody at Mercy Shore had ever seen. It showed 6 people on the deck of a ship in rough weather. 3 wore uniforms, 2 wore medical gear, and 1 stood in civilian foul-weather coveralls. Mara was younger there, thinner, sunburned, and smiling without showing teeth. Around her neck was the same silver watch she still wore. A man in the photo had his arm thrown around her shoulder with the grin of someone too alive to think seriously about dying. Whatever story belonged to that photograph had not followed her into Mercy Shore. Every evening before a night shift, Mara called her father in his assisted living community in Chula Vista. His stroke had taken enough from him to make solitude risky and stares impossible. Their calls were short, repetitive, and comforting in the way rituals become when life has stripped everything unnecessary away. He asked whether she had eaten. He asked whether she had slept. He asked whether she was carrying the whole world again. She always said she was carrying only her corner. That answer pleased him. He had spent 3 decades as a city bus mechanic and had no respect for vanity in any form. Mara never told him about Harlow, the whispering, or the elegant cruelty of institutions that could frame humiliation as professionalism. If he knew how Mercy Shore treated competence when competence lacked flair, he would have shown up with his cane and old Union stare and unsettled everyone in the lobby. The week everything broke open began with rain. San Diego rain always felt slightly theatrical after long stretches of dry certainty. By dusk, roads shone black under street lamps and ambulances arrived in clusters generated by hydroplaning, late braking, and citizens who still drove as if weather were someone else's problem. Mercy Shore was short 2 nurses, 1 respiratory therapist, and a fevered resident. Denise thanked everyone for their flexibility while distributing assignments in a pattern that loaded the least protected staff first. Mara took emergency overflow, telemetry backup, and possible ICU transfer coverage as needed, which in hospital language meant being expected everywhere at once with no authority to refuse. She signed the sheet, clipped on her badge, and stepped onto the unit with the same expression she brought to every shift. Calm, alert, unimpressed. By 8:14 that evening, she had helped stabilize a middle-aged man in atrial fibrillation. By 8:46, she had gotten a teenage appendicitis patient to stop pretending not to be scared by adjusting his blanket and explaining exactly what would happen next. At 9:03, Denise passed her in the hallway and told her to smile more because families found her intimidating. Mara kept walking. At 9:17, ambulance dispatch notified the emergency department that a high-priority maritime training incident was inbound with 1 critical patient, 1 support vehicle, and a security advisory. Everything sharpened after that. Harlow emerged from his office before the overhead announcement had ended. Residents converged. Security opened the side corridor that bypassed the waiting room. Denise began clearing space near Trauma Bay 3 as if optics might influence physiology. When the gurney burst through the doors, Commander Liam Thorne did not arrive in cinematic chaos. There was no dramatic blood trail and no shouting collapse. Real emergencies in competent hospitals often look cleaner and more frightening than movies allow. He came in soaked, pale, and fighting to remain conscious under a thermal blanket while a medic delivered report in clipped phrases over the squeal of wheels. Male, early 40s, training vessel incident off the coast. Impact injury. Suspected chest trauma. Intermittent hypotension, increasing respiratory distress, oxygen saturation drifting, portable scan inconclusive in transit, 2 liters already given, security requested. Thorne had the kind of face built by endurance. Even half-conscious, he tried to shift upward as if sitting up under his own control mattered more than comfort. 1 medic pressed him back with practiced care. The black SUV that had followed the ambulance produced 2 men in civilian jackets whose posture betrayed military training even without insignia. 1 murmured into an earpiece. The other watched the patient continuously. Harlow took his place at the center of the bed and ordered monitors, imaging, pain control, and fluids. A resident repeated him louder, as though medicine improved when converted into performance. Mara moved to the opposite side of the bed and did what she always did. She stopped seeing hierarchy and started seeing information. Thorne's skin was too cold despite warm blankets. The bruising sat too high. Breath sounds were diminished on the right. His neck tightened with each inhale. The radial pulse lagged behind the monitor in a way that did not fit a simple pain response. This was not one injury. This was a man compensating toward collapse. For a moment, Thorne opened his eyes. They passed over Harlow, over the resident, over the fluorescent glare above him, and landed on Mara. The look lasted less than a second, but it carried the odd strain of almost recognition. Then Harlow stepped between them and the moment vanished. Around the room, mockery began in the familiar Mercy Shore way, disguised as joking camaraderie. 1 resident murmured that if Mara gave them a diagnosis, perhaps the universe would end. Another suggested she might merely stare the patient stable. The comments were not loud. They did not need to be. In environments built on plausible deniability, soft laughter can be the sharpest weapon. Mara ignored them until she no longer could. Thorne's pressure dropped again. His breathing grew more uneven beneath the blanket. His right shoulder strained upward with each attempt to inhale. The transport medic saw it too, and for a second their eyes met over the bed with the instant recognition of two people watching the same clock run down. Mara said he was worsening. Harlow dismissed the concern as pain. Mara answered that it was not only pain. Harlow thanked her in a tone that did the opposite of thank her. Mara said he needed decompression readiness immediately. Harlow ordered her out of the bay if she wanted to speculate. The room went still because power loves witnesses. For half a heartbeat it seemed possible that Mara might comply. Then Thorne's fingers twitched against the sheet, his gaze rolled, and the monitor sounded a warning tone sharp enough to cut through pride. Mara reached for the ultrasound probe before anyone else moved. She ordered the nearest resident to bring it up now, and her certainty was so absolute that he obeyed before remembering he could have refused. The screen flickered alive in her gloved hand. The image was imperfect, urgent, jostled by failing breaths and trembling momentum, but she did not need perfection. She needed pattern. She told the resident to look at the sliding on the right. He looked and went blank in the face. Mara handed him the probe and turned back toward Harlow, telling him the patient was building pressure and that action had to happen now. Harlow hesitated for one fatal second, not because he did not understand, but because being corrected publicly by her in front of residents, security, and a high-profile patient was a humiliation his pride could not absorb fast enough. That second nearly killed the man on the bed. Thorne's rhythm faltered. The monitor screamed. One of the security men took a step forward before a nurse blocked him with an open hand. Mara already had the decompression tray at the bedside. She called for a blood warmer, respiratory backup, portable chest setup, and a trauma fellow still several corridors away. Her voice never rose, it narrowed. She directed suction placement, cuff cycling, large-bore readiness, and ICU bed preservation in a cadence so exact that people obeyed because not obeying felt irrational. Harlow moved then, necessity finally outrunning ego. The intervention was fast, practiced, and ugly in the plain way real life-saving often is. Pressure released, air escaped. The chest rose more evenly. Saturation climbed in jolts. Pulse returned from the edge. No one celebrated. Machines merely settled. The staff rearranged their expressions into the look people wear when they want the room to believe they had always understood what was happening. Yet everyone present knew the truth. The quiet nurse had read the danger before the star doctor allowed himself to. Harlow yanked off one glove with too much force and attributed the good catch to the resident. The resident looked at him, then at Mara, and said nothing. Mercy Shore had trained its people well, but trauma rarely rewards false endings. Thorne stabilized enough for imaging and then drifted toward deterioration again during transfer preparation. Mara saw the change first. His skin cooled. His pulse pressure narrowed. His eyes took on the stretched, distant quality of someone nearing the edge again. She leaned close and told him to stay with her. The word commander slipped out before she could stop it, shaped by the insignia tattoo near his shoulder, his escort, his bearing, and old instincts doing mathematics in the background. One of the security men reacted immediately. Thorne's eyes opened and locked on her with stronger recognition now. He tried to say he knew her. Harlow cut in, telling him to save his strength. Thorne did not look at him. He looked at Mara and tried to indicate her again before pain, and sedation took him. The trip to imaging was a blur of coordination. Mara became what she always became in crisis, a fixed point around which the rest of the team unconsciously organized. She corrected a handoff phrase before it became a delay. She anticipated a medication gap before pharmacy called it. She at a documentation error that might have slowed blood products. A young ICU fellow later asked if she knew the patient because of the way he had looked at her. Mara answered that patients often looked at whoever spoke to them like they might stay. It was a useful answer and not the whole truth. Something in Liam Thorne's face had knocked against a sealed room in her memory. Salt wind, engine thunder, a deck heaving beneath boots, rotor wash, a hand slamming a chest seal into her palm. A voice laughing through blood and rain and calling her too calm for comfort. Myra pushed the memory back where it belonged. Mercy Shore did not get that version of her. At 11:06 p.m., with Commander Thorne in ICU and the immediate danger held at bay, Harlow summoned Mara into a consult room near the trauma desk. Denise was already there. So was Resident Patel, and so was an HR witness, which meant the outcome had been drafted before she entered. The stale smell of old coffee sat under the fluorescent light. Harlow did not ask her to sit. He told her conduct in the trauma bay had been inappropriate. Mara answered that her conduct had prevented delay in a life-threatening deterioration. Harlow reframed the issue as undermining attending authority in front of staff, transport personnel, and security. Denise wrapped the accusation in the soft language of professionalism. Mara said it was about outcome. Denise said Mara's tone proved the problem. The HR representative started writing before Mara said anything else. Then Harlow slid a printed incident form across the table. It was already completed, already timed, already shaped into an official story. Pending investigation, Mara Ellison was being removed from emergency response duties for insubordination and scope concerns effective immediately. The cruelty of the moment was not its volume, but its polish. This was how injustice often entered respectable institutions, not with shouting but with a per-written form and a sentence beginning with "unfortunately." Mara asked whether she would be allowed to provide a statement. Denise answered that she would be able to add one later, after the framing had already hardened. Mara signed that she had received the notice, not that she agreed with it. Harlow suggested she take the rest of the week off. She reminded him she was assigned to telemetry overflow. He said she was not anymore. Denise told her to go home. As Mara stepped into the hall, she heard Patel inside the room trying, in a strained voice, to put the truth on record. He stated that Mara had identified the change first. Harlow replied that Patel had confirmed it and should not confuse participation with leadership. Then the door shut. Mara stood in the corridor holding the notice while nurses passed. A transporter pushed an empty bed by, and administrative staff hurried toward elevators carrying binders for meetings no one on the floor would ever hear about. The hospital continued moving. That was the insult that cut deepest. Not merely that institutions could be cruel, but that they could be cruel while remaining efficient. She should have gone home. Instead, she walked to ICU through the staff corridor past Central Supply, where the smell shifted from antiseptic to cardboard and back again. She told herself she was not interfering. She only wanted to confirm that the man whose life had almost been bartered to someone else's ego was now in safe hands. Elena Ruiz, the ICU charge nurse, looked up when Mara entered and recognized the posture of someone fresh from administrative punishment. Mara said she had been called to the principal's office. Elena asked if it was for saving him. Mara answered that it was for not doing so politely enough. Elena, unsurprised, told her that Bed 9 was stable but sedated and surrounded by signs of importance. Military liaison, security, and a person who looked expensive enough to be legal counsel. Then from inside the room came a rough voice cutting through medication and monitors alike. The single word stopped Mara where she stood. The patient had said Ren. Elena asked what that meant, but Mara said nothing. She moved to the doorway and saw Commander Liam Thorne half-conscious, one hand straining weakly against the sheet toward memory rather than toward equipment. At his bedside stood Commander Elias Reed, now Naval Medical Liaison, once something far less easily summarized. He looked up, saw Mara, and went still with the recognition of a man watching an impossible rumor become flesh. He ended his phone call without taking his eyes from her and addressed her with formal astonishment. He had been given her name an hour earlier and had refused to believe it could be the same person. Thorne opened his eyes again, focused on Mara, and said the old call sign once more. This time, everyone in the room heard it. The security detail cleared the room at Reed's quiet request. Elena offered to stay, but Mara declined. When the door closed, the uns of ICU softened into padded distance. Thorne looked at her with the bewildered certainty of a man surfacing through sedation into a truth he had not expected to survive long enough to see. He conveyed his disbelief that she was alive. Mara answered with practical calm that he was alive too, and keeping it that way seemed the more urgent task. Reed stared at her with a mix of relief and incredulity. He had spent the last hour trying to understand why Liam Thorne, half out of consciousness, kept insisting on a nurse no one could identify. Mara told him not to do this here. Reed, who had once seen her in very different conditions, asked whether she thought he had come to Mercy Shore expecting to discover the woman who had kept half a task unit alive on a sinking platform off Samar. Thorne murmured that they should tell them. Mara said no. She had built an entire quiet civilian life on the principle that Mercy Shore did not need access to the past she had left behind. 6 years earlier, Mara Ellison had been Lieutenant Mara Ellison, Navy Reserve critical care transport nurse attached to a joint trauma readiness program that officially taught stabilization and extraction support, and unofficially prepared for uglier scenarios than policy language liked to name. On paper, she instructed prolonged field care transitions and austere resuscitation planning. In practice, she had developed a reputation for stepping into impossible scenes and making survival look infuriatingly orderly. She had not been loud then either. That was where the call sign came from. Not because she was delicate or decorative, but because wrens are small, fast, relentless, and impossible to ignore once they decide a space belongs to them. The name had attached itself after a storm operation in the Pacific where Mara spent 9 straight hours moving from casualty to casualty on a pitching deck, while rotor wash hammered seawater into white chaos around them. Liam Thorne had been there. Elias Reed had been there. The records were sealed, the commendations private, and Mara had walked away from that world after her mother's second stroke forced a different life into focus. She returned home, took hospital work, buried the photos, stopped answering some calls, and built a quieter existence because quiet was recovery, not surrender. Back in the ICU room, Reed asked whether she had disclosed any of that to leadership. Mara said no. Reed asked why not. She answered that it had nothing to do with taking care of patients. Reed replied that tonight it had everything to do with it. Mara insisted that tonight a patient had been crashing and that was enough. Reed observed, as he always had, that she still answered the smallest possible part of the question. Thorne, half lost in pain medication, managed a dry trace of humor. Reed then told her something that landed harder than she expected. Liam had resisted sedation until staff found her. They had assumed the request was confusion. Reed had assumed it was impossible. Hearing that a man from the locked-away chapter of her life had clawed through pain and medication to find her by a name no one at Mercy Shore knew cracked something she had spent years cementing shut. Still, she only repeated that he needed rest. Reed nodded but began making decisions. Administration already knew the patient was high-profile. They were going to want to know why he was specifically requesting a nurse under investigation. Mara stated flatly that she did not need anyone to rescue her. Reed answered that perhaps she could allow a witness. That, from him, was harder to reject. At 1:10 a.m., Mercy Shore's chief medical officer, Dr. Evelyn Grant, arrived in a navy overcoat over business clothes with rain still damp in her hair and consequence in her posture. She went first to ICU, not the trauma office. That alone shifted the air. Denise appeared within minutes, smile bright and brittle, already shaping the version of events she hoped would survive scrutiny. Harlow arrived shortly after, tie loosened, charm prepared. Grant wasted no time on niceties. She asked who had documented the first recognition of respiratory decompensation. Harlow started to give her a summary and she cut him off. She wanted the name, not the spin. Silence spread. Resident Patel swallowed and answered that Nurse Ellison had verbalized concern first. Grant asked for the timestamp. He gave it. She then looked at Mara and asked whether she was currently under conduct review. Mara said yes. Grant asked for what specifically. Mara replied that the accusation was undermining attending authority during a critical event. There are few sounds more revealing than a senior administrator going completely still. Grant asked for the chart audit, the ultrasound capture, medication override times, device logs, and all witness statements collected so far. Harlow advised caution against overreading reactive language in a high-stress setting. Reed suggested equal caution against underreading it. When Grant asked whether Mara knew the patient before arrival, Mara answered that she recognized him during care. Grant asked from what context. Reed cut in that the question could wait until the chart review was complete. Grant held his gaze, understood there was more to the situation than she currently possessed, and allowed the delay. Night settled deeper around the hospital while the machinery of accountability, so often slow, moved with unusual speed. Environmental services buffed distant corridors. The volunteer piano in the lobby sat silent. Upstairs, the possibility that Mercy Shore had chosen the wrong person to humiliate began to rearrange the power map. Round 2 in the morning, Alina checked on Mara and asked whether she was all right. Mara answered no. Alina, satisfied by the honesty, admitted she did not need Mara's life story but would appreciate at least the genre if a military commander had just called her by a secret bird name and a federal liaison was looking at administration like a suspicious camp counselor. Mara described it only as old work. Alina asked if it had been dangerous. Mara looked at her, and Alina answered her own question by noting that Mara did not flinch like ordinary hospital people. Before the conversation could go further, Grant returned with a printout and announced where everyone could hear that the timestamp sequence did not support the incident narrative as filed. Nurse Ellison had identified deterioration at 21:31. Resident confirmation came at 21:32. Intervention started at 21:33 after attending delay. A chart addendum reassigning primary recognition elsewhere had been entered after midnight. Grant turned to Harlow and asked why the event record and his narrative diverged. Before he could answer, A rough voice from the ICU doorway said he could explain. Commander Liam Thorne had gotten out of bed. He did not stride dramatically. He stood because military stubbornness and pain control had made 10 unsafe steps possible. One hand braced the doorframe while a transport chair sat abandoned behind him. Every person at the station turned toward him. He was too pale, but authority does not always require volume. Sometimes it arrives as a room full of professionals instinctively reorganizing themselves around one injured man. Alina told him he should be in bed. He made it clear he had endured worse places. Reed moved toward him with the frustrated resignation of someone familiar with his habits. Thorne ignored him and told Grant that the nurse had warned them twice before his vision narrowed. Grant acknowledged that the record matched this. Thorne turned his attention to Harlow and made plain that the doctor had argued with Mara. Harlow tried to suggest that Thorne's injured condition might compromise perception. Thorne responded that his perception had been good enough to know who had kept him alive. Then he looked not at Reed, not at Grant, not at the frightened staff, but at Mara. He spoke the call sign again, barely above a whisper, and the room changed. Grant asked what that name meant. Thorne answered that the nurse the hospital had attempted to sideline was Lieutenant Mara Ellison, Reserve Critical Care Transport, prolonged field care instructor, and the reason 11 men had made it off a flooded platform alive 6 years earlier. Reed added that she had been decorated for operational medical service and had declined public citation. Grant asked Mara whether this was accurate. Mara answered with characteristic economy that it was mostly accurate. The distinction carried its own history. Reed then summarized the Samar platform incident: structural damage, storm conditions, delayed evacuation, multiple casualties, intermittent communication, 9 hours of triage, ventilation support, improvised transfusion, and stabilization on a rolling deck until retrieval. Thorne, eyes fixed on Mara, remembered her telling him not to fall asleep because she was tired of dragging larger men than him around. The staff heard not only the history but the shape of it. The challenge coin, the gauze folds, the way she moved in crisis. The old scars, it had never been emptiness. It had been experience worn without advertisement. Denise made the mistake of asking why none of this had been disclosed to leadership. Mara answered that leadership had access to her verified employment history and did not require a personal mythology to evaluate her nursing. The sentence landed with quiet precision. Harlow tried one final defense, arguing that prior military service, however admirable, did not excuse procedural overstep in a civilian trauma environment. Grant agreed, and for a blink he thought he had found footing. Then she continued by saying it also did not justify retaliatory documentation, selective blame assignment, or disciplinary action unsupported by the event record. She asked Patel whether Mara's directives had been clinically sound. Patel said yes. They had created confusion. No, whether they had accelerated life-saving care. Yes. She asked Denise, who had initiated the conduct review before collecting full statements. Denise admitted she had signed based on the attending report. That admission sat in the light like a dropped instrument. At 3:00 a.m., Conference Room B, normally home to quality dashboards and bloodless administrative language, became the site of an expedited internal review. Present were Grant, Hospital Counsel Sonia Bell, the head of nursing operations, Denise, Harlow, Patel, a respiratory therapist, 2 trauma nurses, Reed and Mara. Liam Thorne's statement sat sealed on the table because he had given his account and would not be physically paraded again for the room's convenience. Sonia Bell guided the review with devastating dryness. Timeline first, testimony second, documentation third, discipline last. Patel spoke truthfully once he began. Mara had recognized the problem first. He had obeyed her request for bedside ultrasound because her urgency had sounded correct. Harlow had hesitated. The respiratory therapist confirmed Mara had called for backup before the physician order appeared. A trauma nurse described Mara's coordination under pressure as the kind that came from having done the sequence many times before. Harlow defended himself elegantly. He did not lie outright. He invoked ambiguity, stress, and the dangers of parallel command signals during critical care. He reframed the matter as structural concern rather than personal offense. It might have worked if the logs had not existed. Bell laid out printouts showing ultrasound activation, medication override access, incident report drafting, and conduct notice timing. The incident narrative had been opened at 23:48. Denise's signed conduct notice arrived at 23:56, before Patel's formal statement, before respiratory documentation, before imaging attachment, before chart lock. Denise claimed they had acted to preserve review integrity. Bell asked whether preserving integrity now meant writing a disciplinary conclusion. No one had a usable answer. Grant asked whether Mara had been given an opportunity to provide a contemporaneous statement before being restricted. Denise admitted she had not. Grant then asked Harlow whether he had attempted to minimize Mara's role in the chart after learning a military liaison was requesting a timeline. Metadata made denial thin. For the first time, Harlow looked not offended but cornered. When Bell finally opened and read Commander Thorne's statement aloud, the room lost even the pretense of ambiguity. He remembered a female nurse warning the team twice that his breathing had changed. He remembered the attending dismissing her. He remembered her steady voice during the life-saving intervention. He identified her as Lieutenant Mara Ellison from prior operational medical service and described her clinical instincts as above reproach and historically consistent under extreme conditions. He objected to any punitive action against her pending full review and requested that Mercy Shore learn to distinguish insubordination from inconvenient competence. That phrase settled over the table like a verdict. Grant asked Mara why she had not disclosed her prior service when concerns about her role were raised. Mara answered that the patient had not needed her biography. He had needed intervention. Grant acknowledged that she had not answered the precise question, but accepted the deeper truth in the answer. The conduct action was voided immediately. The incident was referred to peer review, nursing governance, and compliance for retaliatory documentation concerns, premature disciplinary action, and failure of escalation culture. Pending investigation, Harlow was removed from supervisory authority over Mara and from sole signature authority on trauma incident narratives. He called the response excessive. Grant replied that excessive had been punishing the person who was right because he disliked the way she proved it. Denise attempted to shelter inside good faith. Bell told her she had ignored due process in bad practice. Denise was relieved of independent disciplinary authority pending review. No one defended either of them. That was the part ambitious people like Harlow and Denise never calculated correctly. Institutions do not love their stars. They love insulation. The instant a useful person becomes a liability, principal returns wearing a very expensive suit. When the meeting adjourned, Harlow stood as Mara did. For a second it looked as if he might attempt an apology, some polished sentence designed to sound regrettable without being vulnerable. Instead, he said she should have disclosed. Mara looked at him with the full weight of all the moments he had mistaken quiet for weakness and answered that he should have listened. Then she walked past him. By dawn, Mercy Shore had become a rumor system with a heartbeat. Night staff informed day staff that a military commander had landed in ICU. Day staff informed each other that a float pool nurse had somehow detonated the trauma hierarchy. Details warped in transit, because humans are efficient distorters when drama and status occupy the same hallway. Mara hated every version of it. In the locker room after shift, Alina admitted she had told exactly 2 trustworthy people enough truth to prevent 6 worse versions from spreading first. Mara looked unconvinced that trustworthy still meant anything useful. Alina told her that what seemed to impress people most was not the service history, but the fact that she had never used it, never once to posture, leverage, or win. Mara said doing so would have made her someone else. Alina countered that maybe it would simply have made the hospital less stupid sooner. Outside, dawn drew a pale line across the harbor. The rain had washed the city without making it gentler. Mara stood under the awning for a moment, breathing cold, wet air while the delayed shaking of aftermath moved through her body. That was the part no one ever saw. In the emergency itself, she became still. The trembling came only after survival. She slept for 4 fragmented hours, woke twice, and spent the rest of the morning trying not to hear Wren in Liam Thorne's voice. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Grant called rather than emailing. She requested Mara's presence for an all-staff emergency department briefing at 4 o'clock. Mara asked why she needed to be there. Grant answered that some corrections should be made in the same place the errors had been witnessed. Mara understood immediately that this meant public repair, and public repair was only slightly less exhausting than public humiliation. Grant seemed to hear the resistance in her silence, and added that Mara would not be required to speak. Mara considered refusing. Grant, however, was right about one thing. Some things, once done in front of a room, had to be corrected in front of one as well. At 4 o'clock, the emergency department staff gathered in the same territory where jokes had once passed under their breath and where Harlow's confidence had so often gone unchallenged. The fluorescent lights were bright. The bay looked ordinary, and ordinariness made the whole scene sharper. Grant stood at the front with the straightforward gravity of someone who intended to leave no ambiguity behind. Harlow was not present. Denise was not present. That fact alone served as its own opening statement. Grant informed the staff that the prior conduct notice issued against nurse Mara Ellison had been voided after expedited review. She stated that the event timeline confirmed Mara recognized a life-threatening deterioration first, appropriately escalated concern, and materially accelerated life-saving intervention. She stated that subsequent documentation and disciplinary actions had failed both procedural integrity and the culture of safe escalation the hospital claimed to value. No one moved. People who had mocked her kept their eyes down. Patel stood stiff and pale near the back, looking as though this version of adulthood had arrived far sooner than he preferred. Grant continued by reminding the department that clinical hierarchy exists to organize expertise, not silence it, and that any culture punishing staff for speaking accurate concern in real time is not merely flawed but dangerous. She did not mention Mara's military past. She did not need to. That was not the lesson she wanted the room to learn. The lesson was simpler and harder. Someone does not have to be loud, senior, flashy, or self-promotional to be right. When Grant finished, she did what polished institutions rarely do well. She named the harm cleanly. She said Mara had been treated unfairly and that the hospital was taking corrective action. In a place like Mercy Shore, plain truth sounded almost radical. Mara stood at the side of the room, hands loose at her sides, not triumphant, not vindictive, only tired. Yet something had changed. Not because they now knew the stories she had kept, not because a commander had spoken her name in the right room. The change was smaller and more real. For one moment, Mercy Shore had been forced to see a person before a hierarchy. The invisible labor had looked back. The quiet nurse had remained quiet, and the room had finally learned that quiet was never the same thing as weak. That evening, Mara went to ICU before leaving for home. Liam Thorne was still sore, still monitored, but no longer balancing at the edge. Reed was there too, less formal now that the immediate storm had passed. Mara did not give them much. She never had. But she stood for a few minutes at the bedside while sunset light faded against the harbor and monitors hummed with the boring reassurance of survival. Thorne looked at her with the weary certainty of someone who had once seen her under far worse skies and recognized the same stillness now under hospital light. Mara check. Ed the line, checked the rhythm, adjusted the blanket, and let the moment remain what it was. Not reunion exactly, not closure, just proof that some lives do in fact circle back and touch again in the places where people least expect it. When she finally left the hospital, she carried no speech, no victory, no interest in becoming a story people told badly at the nurses' station. She carried only her bag, her silver watch, the dented travel mug, and the same self she had brought in. The difference was not in Mara. It was in what the building now knew. Mercy Shore had tried to reduce her to a line item, an inconvenience, a nurse who spoke out of turn. Instead, it had been forced to confront what quiet competence looks like when pressure strips away theater. It looks like a woman standing in terrible light, seeing the truth before the room is willing to see it, and moving anyway. It looks like someone who never needed recognition to be effective, only enough space to act before ego turned dangerous. It looks like strength that does not introduce itself because it does not have time. And in the end, that was the part the hospital would remember long after the rumors thinned and the official reviews moved into binders. Not the call sign, not the sealed reports, not even the decorated past that could have been weaponized years earlier and never was. What lingered was simpler. On the worst night for the wrong kind of arrogance, when a powerful man's pride nearly outran a patient's pulse, the calmest person in the room had been right. She had been right early, right quietly, and right at cost to herself. Then, when the building tried to punish her for it, the truth held long enough to force its way into record. That is rarer than heroics. It is what dignity looks like under fluorescent light.